Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is a continuation of Noam Chomsky's book. It's Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's book, After the Cataclysm. This has been, reprinted and forged by the U.S. government, and it is post-war Indochina and the reconstruction of Imperial Ideology, the political economy of human rights. Till now in the book, we have discussed the dangerous Western press. The Western press is a dangerous group of conspirators. Their media, including the French and British media, along with the U.S. mass media campaign in Indochina, fabricated atrocities of communist iniquity for the sake of covering up their own, genocide in Indochina. The U.S. government committed a genocide in Indochina. They committed a genocide against the people of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And that genocide was covered up. They used, scholarly people like Francois Panchard, like Baron Paul of the U.S., the U.S. Reader's Digest and scholar. He's a quote-unquote scholar. They used Lacoutre, Jean Lacoutre, an international distinguished historical scholar in Vietnam, to fabricate information. And once these sources were put out with lies, they were retracted subsequently. So the scholars like Lacoutre and, Panchard, didn't keep maintaining them. But the U.S. press latched onto them, as did the Western press, like the London Economist, Le Monde, all of these people latched onto them to state that the Cambodian government was a murderous government, and they maintain this through fabrication. The U.S. dumped hundreds and thousands of bombs on Indochina and caused a genocide against the Indochinese people, for which they hid these crimes in these books. And I refer to the Western press of Britain, France, and the United States as international gangsters of colonial fascism and racist subjugation of the Indochinese people. This is what is reflected by this propaganda campaign by the U.S. government, the French government, and the British government. It is a Western colonial gangster group of racist thugs that, mass murder and then hid the crimes and pretended they didn't do anything. And so that is what my assessment is. So let's get started. As usual, I will put the book link in the description section. Please grab the Google link. The Google Drive link will be in the description section of my video. It's download the PDF at the Google Drive link. I always recommend you read the book in his own words. It is such an easy read, and it is very, very informative. These are dangerous people. This Western media is a dangerous conspiracy and a dangerous group of pro-colonial racist murderers. So let's begin. We begin with the Western media. I would consider the U.S. government and its French propagandists as having committed hate crimes against the Indochinese people with all of their media fraud and deliberate lies. The U.S. government committed acts of mass aggression against the Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians, people including the use of prohibited weapons of poison, sarin gas, and vomiting gases and white phosphorus. In addition, they slaughtered civilians without regard to their presence and unleashed a military campaign against the Indochinese people. When we review the After the Cataclysm, post-war Indochina, and the reconstruction of an imperial ideology, we see a familiar pattern of distortions, fabrications, lies, and propaganda for the sake of hiding the criminal actions of the United States government and their genocidal campaigns against Indochina. They not only hid the crimes, but then subsequent to this, they paid or allied with fraudulent media and international scholars to paint a picture of communist tyranny to justify their criminal war of aggression. The definition of a hate crime is a crime of violence directed against an individual for being a member of an ethnic group and targeted for that reason. The French had already colonized Indochina, so we know the West had already known that this is an ethnic group that had already been oppressed. The United States deliberately targeted this ethnic group for genocide by the military murder machine that they unleashed against a defenseless civilian population. Then, to retract from that hate crime, they employed hate rhetoric and hate speech in their media to state that the communists were murderers and tyrants that were genociding their people. So we see two aspects of American racist hate in Indochina. One is the actual slaughter, and two, the media racism and hate unleashed in fabricating atrocities, creating incidents and statements, and taking third-hand, unverified reports as fact to commit this hate crime by the U.S. journalists, including David Aikman of Time, Henry Kam of New York Times, Baron Paul of Reader's Digest, Elizabeth Becker of Washington Post, Michael Parks of Boston Globe, Jack Anderson of Liberal Syndicated Columnist, Francois Panchard, French author and scholar, William Shawcross of New York Times, Newsweek, Cambodian Silence and Subterfuge and Surveillance by Time, printed in 1979. London economists who reviewed Panchard's book and applauded it despite having no basis in fact, and Jean Lacoutre, a French author and scholar, and Le Monde journalist, and in this way, all hid the American bombing genocide by hate crime journalism directed against the communist countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. These people were considered murderers and highly repressive when that was contrary to what visitors saw and reported publicly. We reviewed hundreds of articles of American hoodlums presented in Chomsky's book, showing the height of the U.S. propaganda machinations and their deliberate lies that made hate journalism directed against the Indochinese people, for which they to this day believe they were justified in this sadistic, bestial, criminal human butcher's war waged by the United States government. All Western and American media gave importance to these fraud pro-colonialists who reported lies and fabrication. London economists noted of Baron Paul's book of atrocities, quote unquote, the best book there will ever be of the Cambodian genocide. The motive was propaganda and manifested as Western hate crimes by the Americans, British, and French colonialists who were seeking re-enslavement of the Indochinese people and a mass murder campaign. So let's get started. We're going to do the last 45 pages, starting on page 300. I'm glad you could join us. This is a fair rendition. These, fabrications by Lacoutre that we discussed yesterday is a fair rendition of what Panchard reports. Panchard writes, in an interview in the Thai newspaper Prachahad of June 10, 1976, a Khmer Rouge official said that the Vietnamese revolutionary method was very slow and that took a great deal of time to sort out the good from the counter-revolutionaries. Panchard then cites the conclusion of the reporter of Prachahad and adds the final comment as a separate paragraph. Closing the chapter, this is the great leap forward of the Khmer Revolution. The American version is a bit different. The final ironic commitment is deleted entirely. The final ironic comment is deleted entirely. Furthermore, he says here that the interview with the Khmer Rouge official was cited as Prachahad. That is, there is still another link in the chain of transmission. Note that this interview and the Thai reporter's comment are considered rather significant. The chapter heading is, quote, the overturned basket. When we first read Panchard's original, we assume that the Thai journal Prachahad must be a right-wing journal giving a criticism of the Khmer Rouge. That is what Panchard's account suggests, in particular his final ironic comment, now deleted in the American edition. We wrote in The Nation, June 25, 1977, that the chain of transmission was too long to be taken very seriously, and we raised the following question. How seriously would we regard a critical account of the United States in a book by a hostile European leftist based on a report in Pravda of a statement allegedly made by an unnamed American official, ? Correspondingly, how seriously should we regard a critical account of Cambodia in a book by Panchad, based on a report in Prachahat of a statement allegedly made by an unnamed Khmer Rouge official, question mark? The answer is not very seriously. Whatever one thinks of this, it is evident that the basis for the extreme criticism that Lacoutre appends to this quote disappears when it is properly attributed to a Thai reporter, not a Cambodian government newspaper. Several people, Header Panchad Vikri, have pointed out to us that we were mistaken in assuming that Prachahat was a right-wing newspaper critical of the Khmer Rouge. The fact is that it was a left-wing newspaper, and the actual text is not a criticism of the Khmer Rouge, but a defense of the Khmer Rouge against foreign criticism, something that could hardly be guessed from Panchad's account, and is certainly worth knowing in this context. Furthermore, it turns out that it is indeed another link in the chain of transmission. Panchad's revision of his French text in the American but not British translation is correct. Prachahat did not interview a Khmer Rouge official. Rather, it cites a report by a person described as a, quote, neutral individual in Paris who says that a Khmer official of the new government residing in Paris said to me, here then is an improved version of our original analogy. How seriously would we regard a critical account of the United States in a book by a hostile European leftist based on a report in Encounter of comments by a, quote, neutral person who reports statements of an unnamed American official, question mark? Again, not very seriously. Note that the unnamed Khmer Rouge official in Paris is quite possibly a member of the pro-revolutionary Cambodian community in Paris, whose information is itself second or third hand based through Peking, as Header points out. Furthermore, given the context, it is not so clear what interpretation to give to the comment about the Vietnamese methods being very slow. Lacoutre's reference, as well as Panchad's text, suggests that what is intended is that the methods are too slow in eliminating people. At least that is how we read them. The full context of the original article by Prachahat, however, suggests that what is in fact meant is that the Vietnamese method is too slow in returning former collaborators, including professionals and even former military men, to normal lives to help build a new society. Again, a vast difference. The gist of the article seems to be a call for rapid proletarianization of the urban bourgeoisie, who, as every rational observer agrees, had to be moved to productive work in a country that had no economy and had no way of feeding millions of people who had been driven into the cities by U.S. forced draft urbanization, quote unquote. No one could guess from Panchad's citation that this may well be the intended sense of these remarks. Furthermore, the context and the proper wording suggest a rather different sense for the paragraph quoted from the Thai journal's conclusion. Recall that the article was intended as a defense of the Khmer Rouge against criticism. As Lacoutre gives the quote following Panchad, the Thai journalist says that the Khmer method has no need of numerous personnel. The implication is rather similar to that conveyed by the widely quoted remark by needing only 1 to 2 million people to build the new society. Lacoutre's case 4 already discussed, namely not many people are needed. The others can be eliminated. Evidently, Lacoutre understood it this way, as we did as well, hence his comment about Beria, Himmler, and Nazi Gauleiters. But the context omitted from Panchad's text makes it clear that this interpretation is entirely false. The immediately preceding paragraph and the one in question read as follows. If we may make a comparison, we see that the Vietnamese method requires numerous personnel to supervise the population. It may even turn out that it will not succeed everywhere, and the authorities will thus be charged with a very heavy burden. In contrast, the Khmer method does not need numerous personnel. There are no burdens because they have removed all the burdens out of the city. Then comes the comparison of overturning the basket. Note two crucial points. Placed in context, it is obvious that the reference to the Khmer method not needing numerous personnel means that not many people are needed as supervisors, not that most of the population can be eliminated, whatever one may think of this. It hardly justifies the remarks about Beria, Himmler, and Nazi Gauleiters. Ponchat's citation eliminating the relevant context radically changes and severely harshens the sense. Secondly, note that the phrase, they have removed all the burdens out of the city, which plainly means that the burdens of the authorities have been removed from the city, is translated by Ponchat as follows. Quote, there are no heavy charges to bear because everyone is simply thrown out of town. Obviously, the connotations are quite different. When the proper context is introduced and Ponchat's mistranslation is corrected, we find that the journalists of Ponchat are indeed giving what they take to be a defense of the Khmer Revolution. We will not go into the question of whether this defense is adequate. Rather, our point is that what they are saying is radically different from the impression conveyed by Ponchat, which explains why Lacoutre and we too were so seriously misled as to the character of the Prachahat article. Thus, this final item in the list of Lacoutre's references, number 3, goes the way of the others. It provides no basis whatsoever for his charges, but rather shows that Ponchat has once again flagrantly misrepresented the quotation, the very one from which he took the chapter heading. Two conclusions emerge from this discussion. First, journalists who have been relying on Lacoutre's review, with or without corrections, have built their case on sand. Furthermore, inquiry reveals that when we proceed beyond his published correction to a full list of corrections, and beyond that to correction of Ponchat's original text to which he referred, the sand turns to jelly. The original French has been considerably modified in the American edition. Specifically in the list given, item 4 is dropped entirely. The central example of 2 is changed from a quote to a paraphrase. The final ironic comment based on the translation of Prachahat is deleted, and it is correctly stated that the article did not contain an interview with a Khmer Rouge official, but rather that such an interview was cited. Item 1 was simply an error based on a misreading of a false statement by Ponchat. Item 2 was also a reading of Ponchat. As for item 3, not only was Lacoutre's reference to Ponchat seriously in error, but Ponchat's original translation from Prachahat is in part extremely misleading and in part flatly wrong. All in all, not a very impressive performance either at the source or in the review. But it is this material that had such a major impact on Western journalism, perhaps second only to the Baron Paul book that we have already discussed. Returning now to Lacoutre's point that it is a matter of secondary importance to decide which person uttered an inhuman phrase and whether the regime has murdered thousands or hundreds of thousands of wretched people, we believe that this review of the fact strengthens our earlier argument that it does matter indeed. It appears that the inhuman phrases, quote unquote, in questions may not have been uttered at all, or when uttered, were hardly so inhuman as Lacoutre and Ponchat suggest. It remains an open question whether the regime has murdered, quote unquote, those who died from disease, starvation, or overwork, or whether we have murdered them by our past acts. It is also unclear on Ponchat's evidence whether the quote-unquote regime has murdered the victims of summary executions by government design or peasant revenge, or soldiers out of control, We have now reviewed the two major sources of information for U.S. and indeed Western readers, Baron Paul and Lacoutre's rendition of Ponchat. We turn next to Ponchat's book itself. Again, we face the unusual problem of logic, the trust we place in unverifiable material, which includes the essential and the most serious charges, depends on the trustworthiness of material that can be verified here or elsewhere. In this case, we are restricted to the book itself, as the few articles we know of add little. As we have seen, Ponchat plays fast and loose with numbers and is highly unreliable with quotations. This discovery naturally raises questions about sources that cannot be checked. As in the case of Baron Paul, we can turn to his account of the history and background to assess the credibility of his reporting and conclusions. There is a vast difference between the two books in this regard. Ponchard at least makes an effort to deal with these crucial matters. He offers virtually no documentation, which again reduces the possibility of assessment, but much that he recounts seems plausible both on grounds of inner consistency and what is known from other sources. We have mentioned a few cases where we find his historical account unsatisfying, namely in reference to the colonial impact and the U.S. role, though these are at least mentioned. On his account of Khmer culture and the ideology of the post-revolutionary society, briefly mentioned above, we are not qualified to comment. In his historical comments, Ponchard tends to keep closely to the version of events offered by the U.S. propaganda system. Consider, for example, his discussion of the U.S. and Vietnamese involvement in Cambodia. Since he gives no sources, we do not know on what information he relies, plainly not direct experience in these cases. The major studies give a general picture of the following sort. Cambodia has been subject to attempts at subversion and direct aggression by its U.S.-backed neighbors, Thailand and South Vietnam, from the 1950s. Diem's troops that attacked border regions in 1957, a CIA-backed plot to dismember Cambodia in 1958 to 1960 was foiled. There were provocations from the Thai side of the border, but the Vietnamese frontier posed a much more serious threat. From 1957, but particularly from 1964, American South Vietnamese forces attacked posts and villages, bombed rice fields, machine gun trucks, napalmed and defoliated the Cambodian side and frontier, causing hundreds of casualties every year, Pamanti Thian. Meyer reports that at the end of 1963, the Khmer Sarai, equipped and trained by the CIA, made more frequent incursions into Cambodian territory from bases in South Vietnam and Thailand. And a few years later, the American South Vietnamese attacks, ever more murderous, multiplied against the frontier villages of Cambodia. After the massive and destructive U.S. military operation in nearby areas of South Vietnam, particularly in January to February 1967, Vietnamese peasants and guerrillas took refuge in narrow border areas, leading to cynical charges from Washington about communist encroachment into neutral Cambodia. According to Meyer, by March 1970, when the coup that overthrew Sihanouk took place, they were scattered along the border areas to a maximum depth of perhaps 25 kilometers in the extreme northeast provinces, which were to a considerable extent under the control of indigenous guerrillas. Other sources concur. Relations between the Cambodians and the Vietnamese in the sanctuaries were generally friendly at the time, and there were few military conflicts. The first evidence of Vietnamese encampments on the Cambodian side of the border was discovered in late 1967, a few kilometers beyond the unmarked border. While the hypocrites in Washington and the press fumed in public about North Vietnamese aggression, quote unquote, the internal view was very different. From the Pentagon Papers, we learned that as late as May 1967, i.e. well after the major military operation cited above, high officials believed that Cambodia was becoming more and more important as a supply base, now of food and medicines, perhaps ammunition later, John McNaughton. A year earlier, a U.S. study team discovered the results of a U.S. helicopter attack on a Cambodian village, first denied, later conceded when eyewitnesses, including a CBS television team, reported the facts. One of several such cases discovered accidentally. In March 1969, the massive quote-unquote secret bombing began. It is intriguing to consider the reaction in the United States to the occasional revelations that Cambodia had been attacked by U.S. forces. Roger Hilsman, who was director of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research in the State Department and the Inter-Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs in the Kennedy administration, describes an attack by U.S. bombers on a Cambodian village on January 21, 1962, with an unknown number of civilian casualties. He describes this as a tragic error in map reading. The real intent was to bomb and strafe the cluster of huts near the Cambodian border, where it had been reported that there were Viet Cong guerrillas. It would not have been a tragic error, quote unquote, if a Vietnamese village had been bombed by U.S. planes in January 1962 with an unknown number of civilian casualties. Hillsman's sole criticism concerning this bombing attack against a defenseless village, apart from the tragic error in map reading, which led to the wrong peasants being killed, is that though the plan was well and efficiently executed, it was not well designed for guerrilla warfare. The greatest problem that the bombing huts and villages will kill civilians and push the population still further toward the active support for the Viet Cong. Hillsman is widely regarded as a quote-unquote dove. On March 25, 1964, the New York Times published a report by Max Frankel, now an editor, with the interesting title, Stomping on U.S. Toes, Cambodia Typical of Many Small Nations, Putting Strain on a Policy of Patience. What aroused Frankel's ire was that Cambodia had borrowed a leaf from Fidel Castro's book and demanded tractors and bulldozers and as compensation for the killing of Cambodians by South Vietnamese in a frontier attack. He is referring to the Cambodian response to a Vietnamese ground and air attack on a Cambodian village in which they were accompanied by U.S. advisors. A U.S. Army pilot was dragged from the wreckage of an L-19 observer plane, shot down in the action, and diplomats who rushed to the scene confirmed Cambodian reports that at least one troop-carrying helicopter has landed in Chantria with 3 Americans on board. The Cambodian village of Chantria was bombed and attacked by 12 armored cars, and according to Cambodian sources, 17 persons were reported killed and 13 injured. It was not the attack, but Cambodia's response that enraged Frankel, who explains as follows. It is open season again for the weaker nations to stomp on the toes of the big ones, leading the pack in big power baiting. These days is one of the smallest of the nations, the Southeast Asian kingdom of Cambodia. What Cambodia is up to seems to turn on what Cambodia's young leader, Prince Nordstrom Sihanouk, is up to. Washington has always regarded the 41-year-old premier prince as a clever, headstrong, erratic leader who wishes to serve his people, defend their independence, and develop their resources. It has also found him lacking some of the talent and temperament for the job. For the most part, the administration's instinct has been to try to save a wayward young nation's independence in spite of itself, and at times despite of its own leaders. Officials remarked privately that Indonesia is more important than Sukarno, Ghana more important than Nkrumah, Cambodia more important than Sihanouk. But now Washington is, quote, not only alarmed and saddened, but confused. Of course, Cambodia's current effort to force the United States into a major conference that would embarrass its Thai and Vietnamese friends will be resisted. The reference is to a conference that would settle border questions and guarantee Cambodia's neutrality and integrity in a period when the United States was desperately seeking to undermine international efforts to neutralize South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia so as to avert the major war towards which the United States was clearly driving. But what was most irritating was that the Cambodian effort to stomp on U.S. toes by asking for reparations after a village was attacked by forces trained, supplied, and advised by the United States and accompanied by U.S. military advisors and aircraft. It was this unmitigated gall that was trying the patience of the U.S. government while calling forth a reaction in the New York Times that is unremarkable, as much for the paternalism and racism of its style, as so typical of the annals of colonialism, as for the response to the actual events discussed. In his rather sketchy historical review, Ponchard passes over all of these events of the 1950s and 1960s in silence. His only comment is that the Vietnamese revolutionaries were becoming a real menace to Cambodia. Hardly an adequate summary. He says that in his desire to stop the infiltration along Cambodia's borders, Sihanouk disclosed the location of Viet Cong bases, which were then bombed by the American Air Force. He called it a scandal and a crime over Radio Phnom Penh, but nobody was deceived. The reference is to the 1969 bombings. Actually, Ponchod is deceived. Keeping strictly to the position of U.S. propaganda, he fails to indicate that Sihanouk vigorously and publicly denounced the bombing of Khmer peasants. Turning to the March 1970 coup, Ponchod has little to say about the background. His few comments are furthermore inconsistent. The coup was presumably backed by the Americans, and the United States was not sure what attitude to adopt in the Cambodian crisis. Sihanouk's downfall was bad news. The first of these two contradictory claims seemed to us the more likely correct, given what little evidence is available. But Ponchod does not pursue the issue, a rather important one. He makes no mention of the U.S. ARVN military intervention from 2 days after the coup of March 18th. As for the quote-unquote incursion of April 30, he says only that the South Vietnamese took advantage of it to avenge the murder of Vietnamese by the Lon Nol government. Their savagery drove a number of Cambodian peasants over to the Khmer Rouge. Not a word about the savagery of the U.S. attack, which was amply reported at the time. Ponchod asserts that the North Vietnamese swept up young Khmers to be trained in revolutionary warfare, ignoring entirely the eyewitness reports by U.S. correspondents in captivity, and the U.S. bombing was recruiting Khmers, both young and old, to the Khmer Rouge. Pamanti Tian remarked appropriately that the mechanism by which American bombs create resistance is too well known for us to describe here. With regard to the war in Vietnam, Ponchod also keeps closely to the U.S. government propaganda line in his scattered remarks, discussing quote-unquote North Vietnamese withdrawal from Cambodia by 1971. He says that they returned to their conquest of South Vietnam, the sole reference to that struggle, astonishing in its misrepresentation of the background that is so well documented and familiar that we need not elaborate here. Referring to Sihanouk's attitude towards the struggle in Vietnam, he says that at the time of the Tet Offensive, when he saw how fiercely the population in the South defended itself, he wavered and began to think the North might be defeated. Again, an amazing distortion of well-known facts that are easily documented by U.S. government sources. There is overwhelming evidence from these sources and elsewhere that the Tet Offensive was primarily a struggle between the U.S. Army and South Vietnamese guerrillas. Indeed, the fact is not seriously disputed. In the Mekong Delta, for example, where some of the fiercest battles were waged, there were no North Vietnamese regular forces, and in fact, the total number of North Vietnamese who had been drawn into the war by the U.S. bombardment of North Vietnam, exactly as planners anticipated, was at approximately the level of the South Korean and Thai mercenaries at that point, vastly outnumbered and even more vastly outgunned by the U.S. Expeditionary Force that had for years been attempting to conquer South Vietnam and to destroy the society in which the indigenous revolt was rooted. Furthermore, during the Tet Offensive, the U.S. military continually lamented their difficulties in encouraging ARVN to enter the countryside, particularly in the Delta. To describe the Tet Offensive in Ponchod's terms is a gross falsification and a remarkable capitulation to the U.S. propaganda machine. Such examples as these do not increase one's faith in the veracity of material that is not subject to independent confirmation, to say the least, and should alert any serious reviewer. We have seen no mention of any of this in a single review or comment. Turning to material that is closer to the focus of Ponchod's book, as in the case of Baron Paul, the only section subject to independent verification is the one dealing with the evacuation of Phnom Penh. Here, too, serious questions arise. We have already noted how severely Ponchod's account was distorted by Donald Wise in a review. Turning to his own account, there are many dubious elements. Thus, Ponchod reports the explanation given by the revolutionary government that the evacuation was motivated in part by impending famine. He rejects this argument on the grounds that rice stocks in Phnom Penh would have sufficed for 2 months for a large part of the population with careful rationing. The book cites none of the evidence from Long Nol and U.S. government sources that gives radically smaller estimates, namely 6 to 8 days supply, one of the many cases where the lack of documentation in the book conceals a rather casual attitude towards crucial facts. We can question Panchad's 2-month estimate in our review already cited. In a letter in response, Panchad informed us that his estimate included food illegally stored and maybe somewhat excessive. He also suggests that the 8-day estimate of the Lon Nol government may have been exaggerated in an effort to obtain more aid, which as is possible, though the demand at the time was primarily for arms rather than humanitarian assistance, and in any event still receives the estimate of U.S. aid officials that there was only a 6-day supply of rice. Even if Panchad's possibly excessive 2-month estimate were correct, it remains unclear how famine could have been averted after 2 months had the cities not been evacuated, though the methods were extremely brutal, judging by the most of the eyewitness accounts. As we have already noted, sources in or close to the U.S. government concur. On the question of whether the atrocities in Cambodia, which Panchad graphically records from the testimony of refugees, were the result of a centralized policy of massacre, or were rather, as many close observers suspect, and in insignificant measure, the result of localized peasant revenge and the acts of undisciplined troops, Panchad comes down squarely on the side of systematic and centralized policy. The liquidation of all town and former authorities was not improved, nor was it a reprisal for expression of wanton cruelty on the part of local cadres. The scenario for every town and village in the country was the same and followed exact situations issued by the highest authorities. And elsewhere, after reporting refugee accounts of the massacre of officers and sick or invalid soldiers, he writes, so many accounts contain similar statements that it can be safely affirmed that the revolutionaries had simply decided to kill off the bulk of former civilian and military establishment in the hours following the capture of Phnom Penh. One may perhaps be skeptical that Panchad has reviewed the scenario for every town and village in the country, as is claimed in the cited remark. As for the exact instructions issued by the highest authorities, this is presumably his reconstruction from the alleged similarity of refugee accounts. He offers no direct evidence and is as trustworthy as these accounts. His report of them, his interpretations of what he reports, his judgment about the similarity of accounts of which naturally he can offer only a sample. The cautious reader, bearing in mind the serious inaccuracies of his quotes and citations, where they can be checked, and his careless treatment of historical fact, may want to reserve judgment on the question at issue. Panchad's own conclusions, it is by now clear, cannot be taken very seriously because he is simply too careful and untrustworthy. It is hardly in doubt that the work of this caliber would be dismissed out of hand if it were critical of the United States. It is also worth recalling in this connection that according to published refugee testimony that Panchad does not cite, executions had been ordered halted by mid-1975, though we do not know how reliable this testimony is, or if reliable, whether such orders were observed or changed. As for the similarity of refugee accounts, we have already noted reasons for skepticism. Other Cambodia watchers and scholars who have visited refugee camps and interviewed refugees have expressed different judgments, and we have cited a few examples that have been generally ignored by the media that also raise questions. Panchad himself naturally gives only a sample of the accounts he has assembled. Even the examples he cites do not substantiate his firm conviction that central direction, rather than a localized cruelty or revenge, has been clearly established. To mention a few examples, he cites a Khmer pharmacist who escaped in June 1975. That is well after the revolution had simply decided to kill off the bulk of the former civilian and military establishment in the hours following the capture of Phnom Penh, who reports, the attitudes of the Khmer Rouge varied enormously from one to the next. And we got the impression that their orders were not very specific. Later, he is quoted as saying, "You had to understand the villagers. They had suffered a lot from the government air force. Several people in every family have been killed in the bombardments. Perhaps this observation, far from unique, accounts for some of the subsequent killing and oppression." The same pharmacist speaks of the unaccustomed hard work and lack of food, concluding, quote, "The Khmer Rouge were decent enough, but if anyone resisted them or didn't obey at once, it meant death." In his Le Monde article, Panchad was less certain about the alleged central direction. Here he writes to the Khmer Rouge cadres that it is difficult to know whether they receive orders coming from the government or whether they act on their personal initiative. In general, these articles give the same account as the book, though obviously in less detail. What did Panchad learn in the interim that caused him to change his mind on this crucial point? Question mark. In other connections to Panchad, refers to disarray of policy. On the matter of marriage customs, the subject of much denunciation in the Western press, Panchad writes that refugee accounts differ widely on this point, presumably because of variations in regional practice. And on revenge as a possible factor for killing, he observes that during the Samba Jacquerie of the late 1960s, the police and military were heavy-handed, killing many villagers and burning their homes. The population fled into the forest, which intensified loathing for the unjust administration that was leaving a trail of death wherever it went. When the Sam-Lot peasants took to the mountains in 1968, they were firmly resolved to pay back 100-fold the evil that had been done to them. Recall again that this was one of the areas where the worst atrocities were later reported and where Khmer Rouge control is said to have been very limited. Such examples as these, which can readily be supplemented from the literature, raise serious questions about Panchad's certainty with regard to the central direction of the massacre. There seems ample evidence that other factors, peasant revenge for one, were involved. And it seems to us far from clear on the evidence that he and others put forward that practices were as uniform as he claims. We note once again that not one single reviewer or other commentator in the mainstream press, to our knowledge, has expressed any skepticism about these conclusions, and some have elaborated them considerably. For example, Lacoutre, who informs us that the group of intellectuals who proclaim their Marxist ideology as they had the country to ruin, lead the country to ruin, are systematically massacring and starving the population, and that the quote-unquote auto-genocide of the new rulers shows us that we were wrong when we thought that Auschwitz and the Gulag were the ultimate in horror. Panchad's reference to Lacoutre's review expresses no reservations on these or other conclusions, so we may perhaps assume that he regards them as justified. They go far beyond any evidence that he presents, and as noted, are in part inconsistent with his evidence and are subject to serious question in the light of other evidence to which he does not refer. In the author's note to the American translation, Panchad writes, "I am an exegete by training and profession. I have long been accustomed to applying the methods of source criticism to the body-reported events in order to elicit the historical truth from them. This self-characterization hardly seems appropriate to the work we have been discussing, with its carelessness with regard to quotes, numbers, and sources. We have ourselves been led to undertake some unexpected exegesis in comparing the various texts that Panchad has produced, the Le Monde articles in the French book, the French original and the American and British translation, the Prachahat article and the Panchad severely distorted version of its contents. The discrepancies between the British and American translations deserve a further look as we try to assess the credibility of the unverifiable material that constitutes the bulk of Panchad's case. We have noted several discrepancies between the British and the American translation. In each case, the British translation remains true to the French original, whereas the American translation introduces changes that are not trivial in the light of the way in which the material deleted or modified has been exploited. in the international condemnation of the Khmer Rouge. It is a little strange to begin with that there should be these discrepancies. None are indicated. There is a single translator, Nancy M. Poe. The author notes for the two translations are dated on the very same day, September 20th, 1977, Paris. Presumably they were written at the same time. Why then should the two translations differ? The differences are systematic. Where a question was raised about the French text in the course of the effort to trace Lacoutre's references, the American translation has been modified while the British translation has been left as the original. We note finally that the queries were raised in the United States and that by an international trade agreement, the British translation cannot be purchased in the United States and will not be found in U.S. libraries. The British version is the world edition. Perhaps it is worthwhile to undertake a more systematic review of the discrepancies in an effort to understand just what is going on. To review so far, we have noted the following examples. 1. The British translation includes in the text and as modified by Lacoutre on the cover, the alleged quote, 1 or 2 million young people are enough to make the new Kampuchea, Panchad's revision of the Lamont citation, and the appended statement that the Khmer Rouge are now grimly turning this blood-chilling boast into a reality. All of this is eliminated from the American translation. 2. The quote that is described as an official text by Lacoutre, namely that their line must be annihilated down to the last survivor, has been softened to a recurrent theme of refugee reports without quotes in the American translation, but left in quotes as a leitmotif of justification in the British version, as in the French. 3. With reference to the Thai journal Prachahat, the American translation indicates correctly that there was no interview in the paper with a Khmer Rouge official, as both the French and British versions assert, but rather that such an interview was cited in the journal, which gave a second-hand report. Furthermore, the American translation deletes the final ironic comment about the great leap forward, quote unquote, again softening the impact, while the British version keeps it. We emphasize that these discrepancies are significant in comparison to the gross distortion of the Thai original and the crucial omissions of relevant context that remains in the French original in both translations and is further distorted in Lacoutre's review, where it reached a general audience. 4. There is a further striking case in which the American and British translations diverge, in perhaps a still more curious way. Recall that the author's notes for the English and American translations are dated on the same day and are translated by the same person. They are also largely identical, but not entirely. The American version begins as follows. On March 31st, 1977, the New York Review of Books published an account of my book under the signature of Jean Lacoutre, which provoked considerable reaction in all circles concerned about Asia and the future of socialism. With the responsible attitude and precision of thought that are so characteristic of him, Noam Chomsky then embarked on a polemic exchange with Robert Silvers, editor of the NYR, and with Jean Lacoutre, leading to the publication by the latter of a rectification of his initial account. Mr. Chomsky was of the opinion that Jean Lacoutre had substantially distorted the evidence I had offered, and considering my book to be, quote, serious and worth reading, as distinct from much of the commentary it has elicited. Reference to the review cited in Note 100, he wrote me a personal letter on October 19, 1977, in which he drew my attention to the way in which it was being misused by anti-revolutionary propagandists. The British version, dated the same day, begins as follows. Even before this book was translated, it was sharply criticized by Mr. Noam Chomsky, reference to correspondence with Silvers and review cited in Note 100, and Mr. Gareth Porter, reference to May hearings. The two experts, quote unquote, on Asia claim that I am mistakenly trying to convince people that Cambodia was drowned in a sea of blood after the departure of the last American diplomats. They say there have been no massacres, and they lay the blame for the tragedy on the Khmer people, on the American bombings. They accuse me of being insufficiently critical in my approach to refugee accounts. For them, refugees are not a valid source. The British version then has the following passage. After an investigation of this kind, it is surprising to see that quote unquote experts who have spoken to few, if any, of the Khmer refugees should reject their very significant place in any study of modern Cambodia. These experts would rather base their arguments on reasoning if something seems impossible to their personal logic, then it doesn't exist. Their only sources for evaluation are deliberately chosen official statements. Where is that critical approach which they accuse others of not having? ? None of this appears in the American version. The contrast between these two texts, both dated September 20th, 1977, is quite striking. Our favorable reference to Panchad's book in the American version becomes a sharp attack in the British version. The responsible attitude and precision of thought that receives such fulsome praise in the American version become complete irrationality, refusal to consider evidence, blind dogmatism, lack of any critical approach, and faked quote-unquote expertise in the simultaneous British version. The accusations in the British version are false, and Panchad knows very well that they are false, as is sufficiently clear from the American version penned, it appears, on the same day. Far from saying that there have been no massacres, we wrote in the article to which he refers that there undoubtedly have been massacres, although their scope and character were subject to debate, which we briefly reviewed, including Panchad's grisly account what refugees have reported to him about the barbarity of their treatment at the hands of the Khmer Rouge, in a book that we described as, quote, serious and worth reading. We concluded that, quote, we do not pretend to know where the truth lies amidst these sharply conflicting assessments, all of which, incidentally, assume substantial atrocities and thousands or more killed. As for Porter, the reference that Panchad cites, he begins by writing, there were undoubtedly large numbers of killings in the newly liberated areas immediately after the war by soldiers of the victorious army, and it well may be true that there were summary executions by local officials, though an adequate picture will be impossible to construct for many years. Panchad's statement that, according to Chomsky and Porter, quote, refugees are not a valid source, is also outright falsehood, as he knows perfectly well. In the reference Panchad cites, we wrote, while refugee reports must be considered seriously, care and caution are necessary. Exactly his own explicit conclusion in the book, as we have seen. Porter takes the same position after giving examples to illustrate that the care that must be taken with refugee reports. He writes in the very reference that Panchad cites, this does not mean that refugee accounts are always false or even grossly exaggerated, but in judging the credibility of assertions based on a refugee report, one should take into account, then follow considerations that would be second nature to any serious journalist or scholar. Panchad's final remarks merit no comment, though they give some further insight into his reliability and precision. This comparison, which strikes us as quite remarkable, explains why the editors of The Economist were misled into writing that Panchad forthrightly included some of the main attacks as a footnote to the English language preface, referring to our review, which described the book as serious and worth reading, and thus hardly qualifies as an attack. Recall Panchad's citation in the American edition. They were, of course, reviewing the British edition and naively trusted the author in this respect as in others. Further questions remain unexplained. Why this stream of falsehoods, surely known to the author to be false, in the British edition replaced in the simultaneous American edition by a show of courtesy and praise? ? We note again that the British edition is not obtainable through commercial channels in the United States, and it is not to be found in American libraries, while conversely, readers of the British edition are unlikely to be familiar with the references to U.S. publications that Panchad cites in his series of false accusations. The kind of petty deceit is unworthy of discussion, except insofar that it provides some indication of the credibility of the person who is building the case, largely on unverifiable evidence. The issue is important given the enormous impact of his work and its effect as it has been amplified throughout the international propaganda system in reconstructing attitudes and ideology in the West. We gain some further insight into Panchard's scholarly practice by looking at subsequent translations of his book. The Norwegian translation contains reference to events of May 1978 and therefore evidently went to press long after British and American translations were completed, indeed after they had appeared. The material deleted or modified by in the American translation appears in the Norwegian translation as it did in the French original and the British translation. Evidently, it is only the reader in the United States who is to be spared the material that has been questioned in the United States and that Panchard knows to be indefensible. In a review of Panchard's book that is fairer than most, William Shawcross writes that, quote, Chomsky has pointed out some inconsistencies and mistake in Panchard's book, referring presumably to private correspondence and our published review, but they are of minor nature and do not in any way affect that judgment. The judgment to which he refers is Panchard's comment in the author's note to the American translation, which reads, I was compelled to conclude in the book, against my will, that the Khmer Revolution is irrefutably the bloodiest of our century. A year after the publication of my book, I can unfortunately find no reason to alter my judgment. The evil demon that bedevils quotations about Cambodia has been at work once again. We are by now perhaps not surprised to discover that Panchard has misrepresented himself. The conclusion stated in the book is not, as he alleges in the author's note, that the Khmer Revolution is irrefutably the bloodiest of our century, but rather a distinctly different one. The Khmer Revolution is one of the bloodiest of the 20th century. Actually, we concur with the judgment expressed in the book itself, one of the bloodiest, although we feel that the context requires immediate complementary mention, lacking in Panchard's book, of the no less bloody U.S.-sponsored counter-revolution and direct assault that precipitated the bloody revolution. Shawcross seems to be implying that we do not concur with the judgment of the book. Why, we have no idea, certainly not on the basis of anything we have written. As for the inconsistencies and mistakes in Panchard's book, how seriously one takes them is, of course, a matter of judgment. While we find the conclusion in the book itself valid enough and are indeed unaware of any contrary view, we want to point out the fallacy of reasoning that leads Shawcross to accept Panchard's misrepresentation of the conclusion of his book. The fact is that Panchard's book is highly unreliable where an independent check is possible. It is also true that the errors are of a minor nature as compared with the bulk of the evidence he presents unverifiable refugee reports. As we have further noted, even these reports on which he relies do not support his unqualified conclusion on the questions of central direction and planning of atrocities, and the material that is proven unreliable plays a large role in his argument for central direction and intent. We stress again that it is the verifiable evidence of however minor in nature it may be that determine how much faith a rational person will place in material that is subject to no check. This point Shawcross seems to have missed. In his author's note for the American translation, Panchard writes that although we, the French and the Americans, bear part of the responsibility for the Cambodian drama, nevertheless, quote, we cannot make use of the deaths of millions of Khmers to defend our own theories or projects for society, referring to unnamed accusing foreigners. Shawcross ends his review with the second of these statements and then adds, in fact, of course, it can be and is being done. Shawcross does not say who is, quote unquote, of course, making use of the deaths of millions of Khmers to defend their own theories or projects for society, nor does Panchard tell us who are those, quote unquote, accusing foreigners to whom his injunction is directed. The lapse is not accidental. It would be difficult indeed to find anyone defending the Khmer Rouge as distinct from those who exploit and magnify Cambodian atrocities to demonstrate the evils of communism or liberation, from whom this description fits. The logic should be carefully considered. Shawcross's statement is a plain falsehood, and Panchard's comment on which it is based is at best seriously misleading with a presupposition that is plainly false. There are, to be sure, people who are skeptical of the implicit claim that, quote, millions of Khmers have died as a result of the policies of the regime, surely nothing that Panchad reports substantiates this estimate, which is, in fact, far higher even than his own assessment of casualties, as we have noted. There are other people, though they are few indeed, who have defended the Khmer Revolution on the basis of their own theories or projects for society. We know a few people, in fact, who have offered more positive comments than Panchad himself does. In his discussion of the emphasis on self-reliance, the dignity of labor, the new mentality, and the spirit of responsibility and inventiveness, etc., but to fall under Panchad's injunction or Shawcross's obviously false claim, a person would have to both agree that millions have died at the hands of the regime and justify this fact on the grounds of social theories. We seriously doubt that any such person exists. All of this is simply another of the desperate efforts to create an opposition, which we have observed throughout this review. In fact, there is a different interpretation of Panchad's comment and Shawcross's elaboration, which can be justified, though one at variance with their intention. There are indeed people, a great many of them, who claim that millions have died or have been killed in Cambodia, or who are making use of this alleged fact to defend their own theories and projects for society. It is, in fact, one of our main themes that the mass media of the West has discovered Cambodia's travail, previously ignored, understated, or suppressed when the direct responsibility was incontestably Western, precisely because of its ideologic serviceability. The populace of the West can be mobilized to fear the consequences of radicalism. Attention can be diverted from the proliferating terror within the United States sphere, and the case can be reaffirmed that the West must be prepared to intervene to prevent such awful events as the removal of some gentle land from the free world. Returning to Panchad's book, despite flaws that seem to us quite significant, we still believe, as we wrote in the earlier review cited, that it is serious and worth reading as distinct from much of the commentary it has elicited, and as distinct from propaganda tracts such as Baron Paul, which have aroused general enthusiasm in the West for reasons that are all too obvious. A fair review of informed opinion about post-war Cambodia would, in our opinion, include this book as a serious, though also seriously flawed and obviously unreliable contribution, in some but not all respects, to be placed at the more extreme critical end of the spectrum of specialist judgment and analysis. Such a review, however, would not single this book out, still less Baron Paul, as the repository of unchallenged truth, as the media coverage generally suggests. In fact, as we have seen, insofar as the statements cannot be independently verified, they should be regarded with a degree of skepticism given the fate of those examples that are subject to independent verification. It is noteworthy that not only the media but also governments appear to have relied uncritically on Panchad's, despite his evident unreliability. A British government report released by the Foreign Office stated that many hundreds of thousands of people have perished in Cambodia directly or indirectly as a result of the policies of the communist government, according to the press summary. The Foreign Office report cited reputable observers for this estimate. Only one such observer is cited in the Post account. Father Francois Panchad, a French authority on Cambodia. A careful look at Panchad's work, specifically his way with figures, his estimates, as cited in the Foreign Office, shows that it must be regarded with considerable caution. It is at best suggestive, hardly authoritative. If the press account of the British government report is accurate, proper caution was not taken, though an analysis of Panchad's work should not have been beyond the resources of the British Foreign Office had it been concerned with finding the truth. To complete the review of books about post-war Cambodia, we should mention briefly a third, actually the first to appear, namely the Hildebrand Porter study, to which we have referred several times. This book differs from the later studies by Panchad and Baron Paul in a number of respects. One, it is virtually unread. By mid-1977, when we discussed it in the cited review, it had sold about 1,000 copies. Two, it has been almost entirely ignored by reviewers and political commentators, apart from occasional abuse. Three, it is carefully documented from Western and Cambodian sources. Factors 1 and 2 are explained by a fourth striking difference this book gives, a rather favorable account of Khmer Rouge programs and a detailed picture of the impact of the U.S. war, a continuing impact, as the authors show. The fourth factor alone suffices to eliminate from the record whatever its merits or deficiencies. Published in 1976, the book was well received in the Journal of the Asia Society. In Choice, it is described in a brief note as, quote, a rare combination of humanitarianism and scholarly research. Apart from these notices, the book has, to our knowledge, been reviewed only in our 1977 Nation article, very briefly, and in the New York Review by Shawcross a year later, where its, quote, use of evidence was challenged in the manner we described. It has not been used as a basis for editorial comment, with one exception. The Wall Street Journal acknowledged its existence in an editorial entitled Cambodian Good Guys, which dismissed contemptuously the very idea that the Khmer Rouge could play a constructive role, as well as the notion that the United States had a major hand in the destruction, death, and turmoil of wartime and post-war Cambodia. In another editorial on the Cambodian horror, the journal editors speak of the attribution of post-war Cambodian difficulties to the U.S. intervention as the record extension to date of the politics of guilt. On the subject of unscrambling Chile, however, the abuses of the manfully rebuilding Chilean police state are explained away as an unfortunate consequence of Allendista wrecking of the economy, quote unquote. In brief, Hildebrand and Porter attribute wrecking, quote unquote, and rebuilding, quote unquote, to the wrong parties in Cambodia. In his foreword to the book, Asian scholar George Cahin of Cornell University observes that in the document and comprehensive account, George Hildebrand and Gareth Porter provide what is undoubtedly the best informed and clearest picture yet to emerge of the desperate economic problems brought about in Cambodia, largely as a consequence of American intervention and of the ways in which that country's new leadership has undertaken to meet them. Anyone who is interested in understanding the situation obtaining in Phnom Penh before and after the Lon Nol government's collapse and the character and programs of the Cambodian government that has replaced it will, I am sure, be grateful to the authors of this valuable study. The Free Press, however, is not grateful for an account of the results of the U.S. intervention or the efforts to overcome them, and has shielded the general public from any perceptions of post-war Cambodia that focuses on these issues. Since the book does not form part of the media barrage concerning what must be believed about post-war Cambodia, we will not subject it to any further analysis given our specific concerns here. It is difficult to convey properly the deep cynicism of the all too typical reporting that obscures or completely eliminates the U.S. role in turning Cambodia into a land of massacre, starvation, and disease. While journalists prate about morality, people are dying in Cambodia as a direct result of policies that many of them supported and concealed and now eliminate from history. It is hardly in doubt that the malnutrition and disease caused by the U.S. war, not to speak of the legacy of hatred and revenge, will have lasting effects on this lovely land with the engaging people. It is difficult to conjure up in the imagination a statement from the Cambodian source that would not have served as proof of communist iniquity as it entered the U.S. propaganda system. On the anniversary of the Khmer Rouge victory, Khu Sampan gave a talk over Phnom Penh radio in which he said that agricultural production had improved and people now get enough to eat, to take care of their health and fatten them up. How was this received and interpreted in the United States? ? An AP dispatch from Bangkok cited this comment, adding that he made no reference to the starvation, disease, and widespread executions reported by many Cambodian refugees, but he admitted that the country had suffered untold difficulties since the communist victory. The reader is presumably to conclude that this admission, quote unquote, of untold difficulties such as starvation and disease supports the charges that the communist regime supports the charges against the communist regime. And just this conclusion is drawn by the Christian Science Monitor in the editorial on Cambodia already cited. Quote, reading between the lines is illuminating, the editors inform us. repeating the words of the AP dispatch and commenting, quote, all this calculated mistreatment of a people in order to make a nation self-sufficient ought not to go unnoticed. Presumably, they prefer the situation in Laos, where the United States withholds all but a trickle of aid in the face of overwhelming disaster, or Vietnam, where the refusal is total and even initiatives to normalize relations have been rebuffed by the United States. Recall the widespread acknowledgement that the new regime had considerable, perhaps, quote, spectacular success in overcoming the food crisis caused by U.S. bombing, considerably more so than the other countries of Indochina. It was hardly irrational for the Cambodian regime to suppose that the United States would leave the country to starve after destroying its agricultural system. If the New York Times, the Christian Science monitor, and the media in general were expressing any human concern, instead of simply grasping at any straw to find a way to denounce an official enemy, they would be in the forefront of the drive to bring the U.S. government to alter radically its inhumane policies of withholding sustenance from the countries it has destroyed, instead of gloating over the suffering of our victims in one of the most hypocritical displays in modern history. Bertrand Russell was one of the early critics of Bolshevism after a visit to Russia in 1920, but he also had this to say: every failure of industry, every tyrannous regulation brought about by the desperate situation is used by the intent as a justification of its policy. If a man is derived of food and drink, he will grow weak, lose his reason, and finally die. This is not usually considered a good reason for inflicting death by starvation, but where nations are concerned, the weakness and struggles are regarded as morally culpable and are held to justify further punishment. It is surprising that professionals of humanitarian feeling of the part of the English people are somewhat coldly received in Soviet Russia, ? Similarly, when poor peasants are driven from the jungle, from villages destroyed by bombing, they may seek revenge. How much more apt are Russell's words when applied to the United States, which bears direct responsibility for bitter suffering throughout Indochina and refuses aid to the victims because they do not meet its finely discriminating standards of quote-unquote human rights. It would require at least a talent of Jonathan Swift to do justice to this scene. To appreciate fully the cynicism of the press and editorial comments, it is necessary to recall the role of the U.S. mass media in supporting the quote-unquote secret war against Cambodia. Prior to the Nixon-Kissinger administration, Cambodia had been subjected to U.S. or U.S.-supported armed attack and subversion, but not on a regular and systematic basis. The massive assault against the Cambodians began with the B-52 operation, initiated according to the official record on March 18, 1969. On March 26, the Cambodian government, recognized by the United States, issued statements condemning the bombing and strafing of the Cambodian population living in the border regions almost daily by U.S. aircraft, the increasing numbers of people killed and material destroyed, alleging that these attacks were directed against peaceful Cambodian farmers and demanding that these criminal attacks must immediately and definitively stop. Prince Sihanouk called a press conference on March 28th in which he emphatically denied reports circulating in the United States that he would not oppose U.S. bombings of communist targets within my frontiers. He went on to say that the communists are not the only victims. Unarmed and innocent people have been victims of U.S. bombs, including the latest bombs, the victims which were Khmer peasants, women and children in particular. He then issued an appeal to the press. I appeal to you to publicize abroad this very clear stand of Cambodia. That is, I will in any case oppose all bombings in Cambodian territory under whatever pretext. The quote-unquote secret bombings continued, along with defoliation attacks for which no agency of the U.S. government has yet admitted responsibility. On January 3rd, 1970, the Cambodian government issued an official white paper giving specific details of U.S. and U.S. client attacks on Cambodia up to May 1969 by air, sea, and land, with dates, places, specific numbers of casualties, photographs, etc. Occasional cases of U.S. bombing of Cambodian villages, including destruction of well-marked hospitals, bombing of ambulances, attempting to retrieve the wounded, etc., became public knowledge when discovered by Americans who happened to be on the scene. The usual technique was for the government to deny these reports, then concede them if American eyewitnesses were found to be present. Throughout this period, the press remained virtually silent. Neither Sihanouk's appeal nor the official white paper, which documented murderous U.S. government attacks on a quote-unquote friendly country, were considered worthy of comment by the press. We know of no reference to the white paper in the mainstream U.S. press, though it was hardly a secret. The secret bombings, quote-unquote, continued, concealed by the U.S. press, which was later to claim that it was Richard Nixon who kept the bombing secret from the press and the U.S. public, thus undermining the foundations of our democracy. There was one notable exception, namely a New York Times report by William Beecher, which reported B-52 raids on Viet Cong and North Vietnamese supply dumps and base camps in Cambodia, citing U.S. sources and stating falsely that Cambodia has not made any protest, disregarding Sihanouk's impassioned appeal and his protest against the murder of Khmer peasants, women, and children in particular. Beecher's report also said that in the past, American and South Vietnamese forces had occasionally fired across the border and even called in fighters of helicopter gunships to counter fire that they received from enemy units there. Not mentioned is that the somewhat more important fact that U.S. aircraft attacked Cambodian villages and that according to the friendly government of Cambodia, there were such incidents as an attack by U.S., South Vietnamese, and Korean armed forces on a Cambodian village, along with aircraft at the same armed forces, after which U.S. and South Vietnamese troops invaded and burnt the villages, among other examples. Now the same media has helped conceal these and earlier U.S. attacks on Cambodia as elsewhere in Indochina, and retrospectively eliminating the U.S. role from history, attributing the consequences of the U.S. attack to its surviving victims. The peasant army that captured Phnom Penh did not conform to the colonialist cliche. They were not gentlefolk with a delightful Khmer smile. The troops that seized Phnom Penh were dark-skinned peasants. Their close-cropped hair was covered by the traditional checkered peasant headcloth. Their uniform and faded remnants of what had once been olive green fatigues. They neither talk nor smile. Some appear to be as old as 25 or 30, but majority seem to be between 12 and 15 years old. Many had probably seen a city street or lawn, never seen a city street or lawn before. Their appearance was equally shocking to many of the residents of Phnom Penh. They had suffered bitterly in a war that had been fought with no quarter. Their enemy was a foreign power that had come to destroy their villages and land, an urban society hardly less foreign to their eyes, a colonial implantation that they know only as a murderous and remote oppressor. In the regions that there had been brutal suppression of peasant revolts, there were many scores to settle in the dark recesses of peasant life and history, unstudied and unknown beyond. There no doubt lay the roots of many more. The latent conflict was churned to a tempest of violence by the armed might of the United States, striking its savage blows directly by the hands of its local clients. In Vietnam and Laos, where the circumstances were different, though comparable, there appears to have been little murderous vengeance, little, that is, by historical standards. In Cambodia, however, the dark-skinned peasants exacted a fearful toll. Of that, there is little doubt, by the U.S. racists. Beyond that, evidence is slight and unreliable, and informed opinion ranges over quite a wide spectrum. At one extreme, we find Ponchad, or rather several different Ponchads. One of them estimates peace deaths at over 1 million, including more than 100,000 killed. A second alleges that the Khmer Rouge were making good their formidable boast to eliminate 5 to 7 million people. And a third speaks of, quote, deaths of millions of Khmers. He regards it as established that a centralized plan dictated a systematic program of terror, massacre, and oppression in every town and village, and apparently accepts Lacoutre's interpretation that a small group of men who proclaim their Marxist ideology were systematically massacring and starving people of Cambodia. Across the spectrum of opinion, Across the spectrum, opinions vary. Many, including State Department experts, are quite skeptical of a toll of millions of Khmers. We wonder, frankly, whether Panchad's really believes such figures and offers estimates of killing ranging from thousands upwards, with many more deaths from starvation and disease, though perhaps not the million such deaths predicted by the U.S. government sources before the war's end. Many specialists suspect that executions were heavily concentrated in regions of the literal Khmer Rouge control, unusual peasant discontent and hatred intensified by war and the U.S. bombings, particularly those of 1973. There are also varying opinions on the character and effectiveness of Khmer Rouge social and economic programs and the roots of post-war Cambodia society and the traditional culture, Khmer nationalism, and the ideology of the leadership. We suspect that the main body of informed opinion would accept the tempered comments of such critics of the Khmer Rouge as Charles Meyer, that, quote, one should be extremely careful in one's analysis of the politics of the Khmer Rouge, whose leadership incarnate really a part of the peasants who recognize themselves in them, considering carefully such factors as, quote, the weight of the past, the ideology of the leaders, the menaces from outside, and naturally the psychological factors, as well as the economic, religious, and other ones. Informed opinion would also not dispute the judgment of Laura Summers that, quote, the Khmer Revolution is the expression of deep cultural and social malaise unleashed by a sudden and violent foreign assault on the nation's social structure. If a serious study of the impact of Western imperialism on Cambodian life is someday undertaken, it may well be discovered that the violence lurking behind the Khmer smile, on which Meyer and others have commented, is not a reflection of obscure traits in peasant culture and psychology, but it is the direct and understandable response to the violence of the imperial system, and that its current manifestations are a no less direct and understandable response to the still more concentrated and extreme savagery of a U.S. assault that may in part have been designed to evoke this very response, as we have noted. Such a study may also show that the Khmer Rouge programs elicited a positive response from sectors of the Cambodian peasantry because they dealt with fundamental problems rooted in the feudal past and exacerbated by the imperial system with its final outburst of uncontrolled barbarism. Such a study, however, has yet to be undertaken. The West is much more concerned to excise from history the imperial and colonialist role and to pretend that the history of contemporary Cambodia begins in April 1975 in a manner that is disconnected from the imperial legacy and must be explained by the lunacy of 9 men at the center, quote unquote, who were systematically massacring and starving the population in a form of auto-genocide that surpasses the horrors of Nazism. While many questions remain open about Cambodia during the 1975 to 1978 period that we have reviewed, on another question, the one that primarily concerns us, we feel that the facts are clear and overwhelming. The theory of the free press that we have been discussing throughout these 2 columns is once again dramatically confirmed. The media in this case, as in others reviewed earlier, are serving in effect as a propaganda agency for the state. It is a fair generalization that the more extreme the condemnation of Cambodia, the more confident the claim that communism, quote unquote, lies at the roots of its present travail, the more diminished the U.S. share in responsibility, then the greater the exposure. The nature and quality of the evidence presented is of little moment. It is an astonishing fact that where the evidence is subject to some independent check, it is repeatedly and with remarkable consistency turns out to be fabricated, misleading, or dubious. Furthermore, exposure to the falsehoods and fabrication is dismissed as insignificant and unimportant, or even condemned as apologetics for terror. Known fabrications and material of a most dubious nature continue to be exploited long after exposure. The extreme condemnations that constitute the standard fare in the media rest almost entirely on reports that cannot be checked, transmitted by sources that are revealed to be of extreme low credibility, where they are subject to some verification. Critics are not sent to concentration camps. Western societies are indeed free in this respect. Rather, they are permitted to speak to one another within tiny circles. Meanwhile, an image is concocted of a mighty force that must be vigorously combated by those courageous souls who try to stem the flood of apologetics or it is claimed with equal merit that these lone voices must somehow find a way to penetrate the barriers of silence and unconcern. The propaganda system has been committed to eke what profit it could from the misery of Cambodia. Questions of truth are secondary. The serious moral issues that arise, the issues of the real locus of responsibility, the obligations to the victims, and the probable human consequences of media barrage have been entirely beyond the comprehension or concern of those who preach the most strident tones of moral obligations. What enters history in the United States, and we believe the West generally, though we have not examined the media systematically elsewhere, is a version of the facts that suits the ideological requirements of dominant social groups. Other interpretations, whatever their merits, are simply swept aside. The central theme that liberation from Western domination is a fate to be avoided at all costs is constantly and persistently drilled into popular consciousness. So effective is the awesome system of indoctrination and thought control that even many people who have been critics of or skeptics are caught up in the well-orchestrated hysteria when the facts are in fact, it may turn out that the more extreme condemnations were in fact correct. But even if that turns out to be the case, it will in no way alter the conclusions we have reached on the central question addressed here: how the availability of facts were selected, modified, and sometimes invented to create a certain image offered to the general population. The answer to this question seems clear, and it is unaffected by whatever may yet be discovered about Cambodia in the future. We urge once again, that the readers concerned with the workings of Western propaganda compare the treatment of Cambodia and the other societies of Indochina as well, with the attention given to other cases where the evidence available, the scale and character of the atrocities alleged, and even the time frame is comparable. Timur, for example, we stress again that in the case of Cambodia, as all observers we stress again that in the case of Cambodia, as all observers, even moderate seriousness, agree what happened in the 1975 to 1978 period under review, whatever it may have been, lay beyond our control. Whereas in the case of Timur and other ongoing benign and constructive bloodbaths, that is far from true. Perhaps evidence will be forthcoming to support the claim of the British Foreign Office that, quote, many hundreds of thousands of people have perished in Cambodia, directly or indirectly, as a result of the policies of the communist government. Evidence more credible than the material on which they uncritically relied. There is no doubt that many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, have perished in other third world countries in the same period as a direct or indirect result of the policies of Western powers. Victims of aggression, starvation, disease, hideous conditions of work, death squads, etc. Furthermore, this will continue with continued Western responsibility, but without government protest or media exposure. The conclusions from such a comparison seem obvious. Finally, we should perhaps stress some obvious points about what the future may reveal. We speculated in the preface that the Vietnamese invasion may prove disastrous for Cambodia. Any assessment of the resulting conditions should be carefully compared with what visitors observed just prior to the invasion, specifically with their general assessment that food supplies appeared adequate and that there were certain constructive developments, whether one may think of the regime. If there is a deterioration in the conditions of Cambodia, this is very likely a consequence of the invasion itself. And here again, the Western contribution cannot be ignored, including the special role played by the propaganda hysteria and a climate of opinion of 1975 to 1978 discussed at length above. A no less obvious point is that, for some time at least, the Vietnamese, like the Pol Pot regime, are likely to permit only a guided and selected view, so that interpretation of any evidence that may become available will necessarily have to be subjected to critical analysis. The media record hardly encourages optimism in this regard. So that's the chapter on Cambodia. Very good chapter on Cambodia. We're going to make some comments here. The first 6 pages were not very important, but now it says that we said, according to Meyer. Okay, so we started with From 1957, particularly from 1964, American South Vietnamese forces attacked posts and villages, bombed rice fields, machine gun trucks, napalmed or defoliated the Cambodian sides of the frontier, causing hundreds of casualties each year. Meyer reported that at the end of 1963, the Khmer Sarai, equipped and trained by CIA, made more frequent incursions into Cambodian territory from bases in South Vietnam and Thailand. And a few years later, the American South Vietnamese attacks, ever more murderous, multiplied against former frontier villages in Cambodia. After the massive and destructive U.S. military operation in nearby areas of South Vietnam, particularly in January to February 1967, Vietnamese peasants and guerrillas took refuge in narrow border areas, leading to cynical charges from Washington about communist encroachment into neutral Cambodia. According to Meyer, in March 1970, when the coup that overthrew Sihanouk took place, they were scattered along the border area with a maximum depth of perhaps 25 kilometers in the extreme northeast provinces, which were to a considerable extent under the control of indigenous guerrillas. Other sources concur. Relations between the Cambodians and Vietnamese in the sanctuaries were generally friendly at the time, and there were few military conflicts. The first evidence of Vietnamese encampments on the Cambodian side of the border was discovered in 1967, a few kilometers behind an unmarked border, while hypocrites in Washington and the press fumed in public about North Vietnamese aggression. The internal view was different. From the Pentagon Papers, we learned that as late as May 1967, well after the major U.S. military operation cited above, high officials believed that Cambodia was becoming more and more important as a supply base, now of food and medicines, perhaps ammunition later. A year earlier, a U.S. study team discovered that the result of U.S. helicopter attack on a Cambodian village, one of several such cases discovered accidentally. In March 1969, the massive secret bombing campaign began. So we can see again the cynicism of the U.S. government, the sadistic, bestial butchers of the United States. They did, murderous attack on Cambodian villages starting in 1963 under the Johnson administration. The Johnson administration started a murderous attack against the frontier villages in Cambodia, and then the massive destruction in South Vietnam, and then after the massive and destructive military operations in South Vietnam in January to February 1967, Vietnamese peasants began to go to Cambodia, and then the U.S. government says, how dare the communists, involve themselves in neutral Cambodia. And then by March 1970, there was a, coup of Sihanouk, and then there was a, a vicious bombing campaign by the United States. So it started in the Johnson administration, the racist, butchers, the sadistic, bestial butchers of the United States started their bombing campaign in 1963 and then continued to 1970. So continuing on, we also want to state on March 25, 1964, we're talking about New York Times published a report on Max Frankel, now an editor, with an interesting title, Stomping on U.S. Toes, Cambodia Typical of Many Small Nations, Putting a Strain on a Policy of Patience. What aroused Frankel's ire was that Cambodia had borrowed a leaf from Fidel Castro's book and demanded tractors and bulldozers as compensation for the killing of Cambodians by South Vietnamese in a frontier attack. He was referring to the Cambodian response to a Vietnamese ground and air attack on Cambodian village in which they were accompanied by U.S. advisors. A U.S. Army pilot was dragged from the wreckage of an L-19 observer plane, shot down in action, and diplomats who rushed to the scene confirmed Cambodian reports that at least one troop-carrying helicopter landed at Chantria with 3 Americans on board. The Cambodian village of Chantria was bombed and attacked by 12 armored cars, according to Cambodian sources. 17 persons were reported killed and 13 injured. And then Frankel made an explanation. But now Washington is not only alarmed and saddened, but confused, according to Frankel. Of course, Cambodians' current effort to force the United States into a major conference that would embarrass its Thai and Vietnamese friends will be resisted. And so you can see that this is a fraud. This is a fraud, journalist, a racist fraud of the American government, Max Frankel, on March 25, 1964, stating, this is during the Johnson administration that he states the racist, mass murder campaign by the U.S. government. How dare the Cambodians ask for reparations? Again, you criminally instigate a war, and you criminally bomb people of the third world. And then you look the other way and say, how dare they talk? The U.S. is an arrogant group of, butchers, sadistic, bestial, arrogant butchers. That is what we see from this, nasty bombing campaign of the United States. So continuing on, we see, so we talked about Panchad's book. We went over Panchad's book. Basically terrible book. It's a terrible book. It's, it's really just fraudulent, a lot of fraudulence. He does say that it's worth reading if you're interested in Cambodia, but he says, be very skeptical of all the information, typical of Western books. Ideology is key for the Western frauds. Their murder campaigns, they, subtly include ideologic statements and thought control to make it look like they're, they're doing the right thing. Typical thing, the Western, governments, the Western press, as well as the U.S. media, mainly the U.S. media, but he also alludes very much to the Western media that introduce thought control and, create the standard propaganda and hate crimes. It's called hate crime journalism when they do their murder campaign and then cover up their colonial atrocities through pointing to the people that, eventually got independence. So continuing on, Panchad's book, we talked about Panchad's book. We said the kind of petty deceit is unworthy of discussion, except insofar as it provides some indication of the credibility of a person who's building a case on largely unverifiable evidence. The issue is important given the enormous impact of his work and its effect as it has been amplified throughout the international propaganda system in reconstructing attitudes and ideology in the West. So Panchad's book served as a way to, reconstruct the ideologies in the West, the racist frauds of, the U.S. government, the British and the French governments. All of these people are racist frauds, highly ideologic, pro-colonialist butchers, imperialist butchers, sadistic, bestial butchers. The U.S. is number one, but France and Britain are part of their international gangster network of colonial, press fabrication and press deceit and conspiratorial Western propaganda. So continuing on, returning to Panchad's books, so he also says that using Panchad's book and Shawcross's elaboration on Panchad's book, the populace of the West can be mobilized to fear the consequences of radicalism. Attention can be diverted from the proliferating terror within the U.S. sphere, and the case can be reaffirmed that the West must be prepared to intervene to prevent such awful events as the removal of some, quote, gentle land from the free world. So that's, pretty much Panchad's book. Now, it is noteworthy that not only the media, but also governments appear to have relied uncritically on Panchad despite evident unreliability. The British government report released by a foreign office stated that, quote, many hundreds of thousands of peasants of people have perished in Cambodia, directly or indirectly, as a result of the policies of the communist government, according to the press summary. The Foreign Office report cited, quote, reputable observers for this estimate. Only one such observer is cited in the Post account, Father Francois Panchad, a French authority on Cambodia. A careful look at Panchad's work, specifically his way with figures, the estimates are cited by the Foreign Office, shows that it must be regarded with considerable caution. It is at best suggestive, hardly authoritative. If the press account of the British government report is accurate, proper caution was not taken, though an analysis of Panchad's work should not have been beyond the resources of the British Foreign Office had it been concerned with finding the truth. So you can see the British government engaged in fraud. It's a fraud government of whites. The British government engaged in fraud, and the British government Foreign Office produced a report stating, exactly what Panchad said, that, communist iniquity was causing murder in Cambodia. It was all lies. It was deliberate lies propagated by Panchad, another fraud French liar. So it's a racket of Western gangster, colonialist gangsters that are trying to get the U.S. out of war crimes. America is a war criminal state of bestial, savage butchers. So continuing on, so we went on to say, it is difficult to convey properly the deep cynicism of the all too typical reporting that obscures or completely eliminates the U.S. role in turning Cambodia into a land of massacre, starvation, and disease. While journalists prate about morality, people are dying in Cambodia as a direct result of policies that many of them supported and concealed and now eliminate from history. It is hardly in doubt that the malnutrition and disease caused by the U.S. war, not to speak of the legacy of hatred and revenge, will have a lasting effect upon this quote-unquote lovely land of engaging people. It is difficult to conjure up in the imagination a statement from a Cambodian source that would not have served as proof of communist iniquity as it entered the U.S. propaganda system. On the anniversary of the Khmer Rouge victory, Q Sampan gave a talk over Phnom Penh radio in which he said that agricultural production has improved and people now get enough to eat to take care of the health and fatten them out. How was this received and interpreted in the United States? An AP dispatch from Bangkok cites the statement, adding that he, quote, made no reference to starvation, disease, and widespread executions reported by many Cambodian refugees, but he admitted that the country had suffered untold difficulties since the communist victory. The reader is presumably to conclude that this admission of untold difficulties, such as starvation and disease, supports the charges against the communist regime. And this conclusion is drawn by the Christian Science Monitor in the editorial in Cambodia already cited. Reading between the lines is illuminating, the editors inform us, repeating the wording of the AP dispatch and commenting, all this calculated mistreatment of a people in order to make a nation self-sufficient ought right not to go unnoticed. Presumably, they prefer the situation in Laos, where the United States withhold all but a trickle of aid in the face of overwhelming disaster, or Vietnam, where the refusal is total, and even initiatives to normalize relations have been rebuffed by the United States. And so basically, the success of the U.S. bombing, is responsible for the countries of Indochina. Basically, so you can see, the U.S., it's a fraud. It's all fraud. The Christian Science Monitor follows the propaganda line, the Western propaganda line of, communism. Q Sampan is responsible for the genocide. He said nothing of the sort. Typical fraud. Then we get to, similarly, when poor peasants are driven into the jungle from villages destroyed by bombing, they may seek revenge. How much more apt are Russell's words, Bertrand Russell, who wrote of the Bolshevism and, tyrannous regulation as a result of Western imperialism, applied to the United States. How much more apt are Russell's words when applied to the United States, which bears direct responsibility for bitter suffering throughout Indochina and now refuses to aid the victims because they do not meet its finally discriminating standards of human rights. It would require at least the talent of a Jonathan Swift to do justice to the scene. To appreciate the full cynicism of the press and editorial comments, it is necessary to recall the role of the U.S. mass media in supporting the secret war against Cambodia. Prior to the Nixon-Kissinger administration, Cambodia had been subject to U.S. or U.S.-imposed armed attack and subversion, but not on a regular and systematic basis. The massive assault against Cambodia began with B-52 operations initiated, according to the official record, on March 18, 1969. Continuing on, it's a mass murder. We know all that. And then Sihanouk raised a statement that I appeal to you to publicize this very clear stand of Cambodia. That is, I will, in any case, oppose all bombings on Cambodian territory, whatever the pretext. The secret bombing continued along with defoliation tasks for which no agency of the United States government has yet admitted responsibility. So they do their mass murder campaign and they wash their hands. Continuing on, the press, fabricated. Cambodia issued a white paper. The white paper was, very detailed states and places of the bombings, occasional cases of U.S. bombings in Cambodian villages. including hospitals, became public knowledge when discovered by Americans who happened to be on the scene. The usual technique was the government denied the reports, the U.S. government denied reports and conceded them if eyewitnesses that were Americans were present. The press remained virtually silent. Neither Sihanouk's appeal nor the official white paper were documented murderous U.S. assaults, which documented murderous U.S. government attacks on a friendly country were worthy of comment in the press. And there was no mention. The secret bombings continued concealed by the U.S. press, which was later to claim that it was Richard Nixon who, engaged the bombings. The typical thing, the U.S. Congress, attributes blame to Nixon. It's a group of homosexual frauds. It's a group of racist frauds that, just attribute blame and say, oh, that's it. We just blame Nixon and he's impossible to prosecute. So that's the way. They need all to go to jail. The whole Congress needs to be placed in jail and in confinement. And continuing on, the next statement we have is the same media that helped conceal these and earlier U.S. attacks on Cambodia, as elsewhere in Indochina, are retrospectively eliminating the U.S. role from history and attributing the consequences of U.S. attack to its surviving victims. So again, the ideologic game of the U.S. media is to eliminate the U.S. role and basically get rid of the U.S. role and make it, the Cambodians were remarkable. The peasant army that captured Phnom Penh did not conform to colonialist cliché. They had suffered bitterly in a war that had been fought in no quarter. The enemy was a foreign power that had come to destroy their villages and land, and an urban society hardly less foreign to their eyes, a colonial implantation that they knew only as a murderer and a remote oppressor in the regions where there had been brutal suppression and peasant revolts. There were many scores to settle in the dark recess of peasant life and history, unstudied and unknown beyond. There no doubt lay the roots of many more. The latent conflict was churned to a tempest of violence by the armed might of the United States, striking its savage blows directly or by the hands of its local clients. In Vietnam on loss, where the circumstances were different though comparable, there appears to have been little murderous vengeance, little that is by historical standards. In Cambodia, however, the dark-skinned peasants enacted a fearful troll. Of that, there is little doubt. So, of course, the U.S. government, they're racist against the Cambodians because they're dark-skinned. They provided a propaganda campaign, all sorts of racist purity ideologies in the U.S., Congress and its, presidents, racist ideologies and racist fraud. These are frauds of the U.S. government. So pretty much that's it. We finished with the times, the bloodbaths, etc. We're going to make our final comments. It's 8 pages. Please bear with us. It'll be done in 10 minutes. We have explored some of the ways in which the propaganda systems of the West, primarily that of the United States, have faced the major task noted in chapter 1 of this volume. Not surprisingly, inquiry reveals a highly selective culling of the facts and much outright lying. Some areas of the world are almost entirely blacked out, where disclosure of major abuses would disturb both pliable clients and the U.S. economic, military, and political interests that find this pliability advantageous. As we have described throughout the 2 volumes, the first principle of the free press is the averting of the eyes from benign or constructive terror, along with the general avoidance of invidious language and the sympathetic understanding for the difficult problems faced by the terrorizing elites backed by the United States. In sharp contrast, countries that ordinarily evoke minimal Western interest are thrust into the limelight when, quote unquote, enemy terror and the evils of communism can be revealed and other useful lessons drawn. Thus, the second principle of the free press is the intense and dedicated search for nefarious terror, which can be brought into focus without giving offense to any important groups and which contributes to domestic and ideologic mobilization. Further devices used in handling nefarious terror, as we have described, include the stripping away of historical context, fabrication, and myth creation. Useful myths, once successfully instituted, are virtually immune to correction. In focusing on refugees fleeing from Indochina and the prevailing harsh conditions there, the Western media employ a third principle of the free press, namely agent transference. That is the critical role of the United States in maintaining internecine conflict from 1954 and its more direct shattering of the Indochinese society and their economic foundations is acknowledged only occasionally and as an afterthought. The only agents to whom responsibility is indignantly attributed for the suffering in Indochina are the new regimes that came into power in presumably normal environment in 1975. Death and suffering from malnutrition and disease in societies brought to ruin by U.S. intervention are displayed as proof of the evil nature of communism. Meanwhile, the U.S. sphere of influence, working conditions of extraordinary severity, massive dispossession of the peasantry, child labor, near slavery, starvation in the midst of rapid economic quote-unquote growth, and similar concomitants of development in accord with the free world model are, if not noted at all, dismissed as an unfortunate element of the process of modernization. And the hundreds of thousands of refugees from Latin American sub-fascism and the plight of the victims of the Indonesian aggression in East Timor or other benign and constructive terror in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, and the causes of their plight are studiously ignored in recognition of the friendly client state of the official terrorists and the absence of any useful lessons to be drawn from their depredations. There are further and more general aims to be observed by the extensive effort to dispel what the Wall Street Journal calls the simple-minded myth, quote unquote, that Indochina's suffering is somehow related to U.S. actions over the past 30 years from the groups that dominate economic, social, political, and intellectual life in the United States. It is a matter of urgency to ensure that no serious challenge is raised to their predominant role, either in ideology or in practice. While mild social reforms have been introduced in the United States, others now conventional in Western Europe, national health insurance, minimal worker participation in industry, etc., have been effectively resisted here, and there has been remarkable success in designing policies so that state intervention in the economy and social life serves the need of the wealthy and powerful. We have noted that the absence of an organized left opposition in the United States has facilitated the work of this system of thought control and indoctrination. U.S. ideologists have been unusually successful in conducting the engineering of consent, quote unquote, a technique of control that substitutes for the use of force in societies with democratic forms. To serve this end, every effort must be made to discredit what is called socialism or communism. In its more vulgar form, the argument is that socialism or Marxism, which in practice means unwelcome social reforms, since radical institutional change is hardly an immediate issue, leads inevitably to Gulag. The process of agent transference has made more plausible the doctrine that socialism must inevitably become tyranny. A recent media favorite is the group of Paris, quote, new philosophers whose congenial message that Marxism equals Gulag has assured them a ready and uncritical audience in the United States and Western Europe. In fact, their critique of authoritarian elements in Marxism-Leninism is remarkably shallow as compared with the long traditions of left-wing libertarians, though that has been virtually ignored in the West. And their enormous success in France reflects, in part, conditions specific to French intellectual life, but U.S. media have little care or understanding for any of this. The access of this group to the media and the receptivity to their slogans is a perfect counterpart to the curtain of silence drawn over the proliferating gulags in the U.S. sphere, as well as the agent transference in Indochina. There is, to be sure, an element of absurdity in the constant refrain that socialism equals Gulag, as revealed by events in the underdeveloped societies. A comparison of the problems facing such societies as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Cuba, Mozambique, etc., with the situation in the industrial West would simply be ridiculed in societies that were not subjected to such effective ideologic control as ours. But despite the inherent absurdity of attributing, say, revenge killing by Cambodian peasants who were bombed out of their homes by Western force, or to Marxism or atheism, quote unquote, the practice is common and quite successful as a tactic of engineering consent to the priorities and structures of contemporary state capitalism. In the United States, this tactic has become a virtual reflex. Bolshevik and later Stalinist crimes have regularly been exploited as a weapon against the movements seeking reform or revolutionary change. During the Red Scare after World War I, which was quite effective in controlling labor militancy and eliminating radical intellectual currents, the Wall Street Journal will. We talk of parlor Bolshevists, but what of those other Bolshevists in the cabinet or at any rate near the throne? Similar accusations loosely associating Reform Democrats with Stalinist crimes, despite the eager and frightened collaborations of many liberals, were common during the era mislabeled McCarthyism. Harry Truman even denounced the civil rights movement of the 1950s as a communist plot, conceding in response to inquiry that he had no proof, but explaining, I found that usually troubling when troubling hits the country, the Kremlin is behind it. The 1970 campaign against big government, understood to cover health and welfare activities but not the police and military establishment, is likewise facilitated by a propaganda barrage carrying the implicit message that socialism equals gulag. In this context, too, it is an effective tactic to focus attention on real or invented atrocities committed in undeveloped ex-colonies that use the phrase socialism in reference to their programs of mass mobilization under authoritarian state control to carry out industrialization and modernization. One final factor merits words of comment. So-called North-South conflicts do not necessarily take the form of imperial intervention. As various levels and in multitude of interactions, there is a continuing struggle over access to resources, terms of trade, opportunities for international capital, and other problems. A general public mood of hostility to the third world is useful to the managers of the industrial democracies as they attempt to manipulate these conflicts to their benefit. In contrast, the sympathy towards third world independence movements that developed during the post-World War II struggles for national liberation, brutally repressed primarily by France and the United States, is an impediment to the position of measures that will meet the requirements of the world's wealthy industrial powers. In this context, it is useful to engender hatred, contempt, and moralistic outrage directed against the nationalist movements of the third world, particularly those that have recently escaped the dominations of the United States. It should hardly come as a surprise, therefore, that a major effort should be directed toward reversing the worldwide currents of sympathy towards the people of Indochina that were aroused by the assault of the U.S. war machine. That struggle came to be perceived as symbolic of the conflicts between the industrialized West and the former colonial domains, and it imposed barriers to the mobilization of public support for the traditional methods that may be required to preserve a favorable investment climate in the coming era. These remarks bear directly on the framework of Western propaganda. They do not touch another and very different question. How should one evaluate the programs and character of the countries that have been liberated from Western domination or respond to developments there? Our primary concern here has been U.S. global policy and propaganda and the filtering and distorting of Western ideology, not the problem of reconstruction and modernization in societies that have been victimized by Western imperialism. Correspondingly, we have not developed or expressed our view here on the nature of the Indochinese regime. To assess the contemporary situation in Indochina and the programs of the current ruling groups is a worthwhile endeavor, but it has not been our objective. And for appropriate response, its central component in the current situation should be a committed and very substantial effort to help the victims insofar as this is possible, those who are oppressed, those who have fled, those who are seeking to reconstruct some kind of viable existence from the wreckage. Such response is not to be discerned among the dominant classes and states of either the East or West. There is no single cause for the misery and oppression that we find in every part of the world, but there are some major causes, and some of these are close at hand and subject to our influence and ultimately our control. These factors are the social matrix in which they are embedded will engage the concern and efforts of people who are honestly committed to alleviate human suffering and to contribute to freedom and justice. The success of the free press and in reconstructing imperial ideology since the U.S. withdrawal from Indochina has been spectacular. The shift of the United States from causal agent to concerned bystander and even to leader in the world struggle for human rights in the face of its empire of client fascism and long vicious assault on the peasant societies of Indochina is a remarkable achievement. The system of brainwashing under freedom with mass media voluntary self-censorship in accord with the largest interest of the state has worked brilliantly. The new propaganda line has been established by endless repetition of the big distortions and negligible grant of access to non-establishment points of view, all rendered more effective by the illusion of equal access and the free flow of ideas. U.S. dissenters can produce these samizdats freely and stay out of jail, but they do not reach the general public or the free press except on an episodic basis. This reflects the power and interest that benefits from the uncontrolled arms race, the status quo of domestic economic arrangements, and the external system of multinational expansion in collaboration with the Shahs, Suhartos, Marcoses in the contemporary, quote, development and sacking of the third world. Change will come only when material facts arouse sufficient numbers to force a reassessment of policy. At the present time, the machine expands, the mass media adopts to the political economy, and human rights are set aside except in the rhetorical flourishes useful for ideologic reconstruction. So excellent book, Noam Chomsky. I'm going to just make a quick word, basically in contrast, the sympathy towards third world independence movements that developed during the post-World War II struggles for national liberation, brutally repressed primarily by France and the United States, is an impediment to the imposition of measures that will meet the requirements of the world's wealthy industrial power. So you can see France and the United States were imperial gangsters against the third world peoples and brutally repressed any form of socialization and democratization of these societies. So excellent book, Noam Chomsky, Edward Herman, After the Cataclysm, Post-War Indochina, and the Reconstruction of Imperial Ideology, concealed in the little title, Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 2. And that was it. It's about 2 hours. I'm going to just give some closing remarks. Again, please feel free to download the book at the PDF in the Google link in the description section. We begin with the Western media. I would consider the U.S. government and its French propagandists as having committed hate crimes against the Indochinese people, which all of their media fraud and deliberate lies. The U.S. government committed acts of mass aggression against the Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodian people, including the use of prohibited weapons of poison sarin gas and vomiting gas and white phosphorus. In addition, they slaughtered civilians without regard to their presence and unleashed a military campaign against the Indochinese people. When we review after the cataclysm in Indochina, we see a familiar pattern of distortions, fabrications, lies, and propaganda for the sake of hiding the criminal actions of the United States government in their genocidal campaigns against Indochina. They not only hid the crimes, but then subsequent to this, they paid or allied with fraudulent media and international scholars to paint a picture of communist tyranny to justify their criminal actions. The definition of a hate crime is a crime of violence directed against an individual for being a member of an ethnic group and targeted for that reason. The French had already colonized Indochina, so we know the West had already known that this ethnic group had been oppressed. The United States deliberately targeted this ethnic group for genocide by their military murder machine that they unleashed against the defenseless civilian population. Then, to retract from that hate crime, they employed the hate rhetoric and hate speech in the media to state that the communists were murderers and tyrants that were genociding the people. So we see two aspects of American racist hate in Indochina. One, the actual slaughter, and two, the media racism and hate unleashed in fabricating atrocities, creating incident statements and myths, and taking third-hand unverified reports as fact to commit this hate crime by the U.S. journalists, including David Aikman of Time, Henry Kam of the New York Times, Baron Paul of Reader's Digest, Elizabeth Becker of Washington Post, Michael Parks of the Boston Globe, Jack Anderson of Liberal Syndicated Columnist, Francois Panchard, French author and scholar, William Shawcross of the New York Times, Newsweek, Cambodian Silence, Subterfuge, and Surveillance by Time, printed in 1979. London economists who reviewed Panchard's book and applauded it despite having no basis in fact, and Jean Lacoutre, French author and scholar and Le Monde journalist, and in this way hid the American bombing, genocide by hate crime journalism directed against the communist countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. These people were considered murderers and highly repressive when that was contrary to what visitors saw and reported publicly. We reviewed hundreds of articles of American hoodlums presented in Chomsky's book, showing the height of the U.S. propaganda machinations and their deliberate lies that made hate journalism directed against the Indochinese people, for which they to this day believe they were justified in this sadistic, bestial, criminal, human butcher's war waged by the United States government. All Western media gave the importance to these fraud pro-colonialists who reported lies and fabrication. London economists noted of Baron Paul's book of atrocities, quote, the best book there will ever be of the Cambodian tragedy. The motive was propaganda and manifested as Western hate crimes by the Americans, British, and French colonialists who were seeking re-enslavement of the Indochinese people and a mass murder campaign. So that's it. 2 hours. Glad you could join us. Join me tomorrow for Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies. Krishna Iyer with the Irish Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.